Day one for Fed Chair Jay Powell on the Hill just wrapping up. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. Joe, the bottom line is higher and potentially faster when it comes to interest rates.
Yeah, some real news coming out of this hearing. These can be snoozers lately, but of course, there's so much expectation for Jay Powell to make headlines and move markets when he speaks. He really did so today, didn't he?
And then there was all the politics, whether or not it was how much banks need to have as a requirement, the debt ceiling, climate change, who's going to be his number two.
Yeah, right. And of course, everyone's filming TV commercials for campaign season while they're at it. For more on this, let's bring in our expert. Michael McKee is with us in Washington, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. Michael, was this an exercise in course correction for the sake of the markets, or did Jay Powell just predict the future?
I don't think it was course correction so much as just telling people the obvious, that the Fed is going to be raising rates more. We knew that because they'd already told us back in December they thought they'd get to 5.1%, which would imply a top rate of 5.25%. And then the question becomes how fast they get there. Do they do 50 or 25? And they've basically gone down to 25. Now he's saying, well, if the data continue to come in hot, as we saw with the January jobs and inflation reports, then they might go above that 5.25%. But a number of Fed officials have said that, and it's kind of logical. He also said that they could do 50 basis points. He didn't say 50, but he said we could increase the pace if the data come in strong. But he left himself a big out because he said if the totality of the data tell us that we need to do this. So it's going to be the jobs report, the CPI report, maybe the retail sales report. They're all going to have to come in badly, or the Fed is probably still going to do 25. I would call this sort of a 72-hour policy reset because he won't say much different tomorrow, but then 8:30 Wall Street time on Friday morning, we get the jobs report, and we may see the markets completely readjust again, depending on what we get.
Mike, did the bank lobbyists do their job?
Bank lobbyists did appear to do their jobs. The Fed and other bank regulators are looking at capital requirements, especially a surcharge for what they call the systemically important financial institutions, the SIFIs, which are the biggest banks in the country, and whether they need to raise capital a little bit higher. Also, some of the broad regulations, like the leverage ratios and things like that. And the bank lobbyists, of course, don't want any higher capital requirements. And so there were a lot of questions about what the Fed is going to do. Powell turning them pretty much all aside, saying Michael Barr, the new vice chairman for supervision, is still working on that. But they will be taking into account the size of banks, tailoring they talked about a lot, the size and what the composition of their balance sheet is. So how risky they are in determining who might have to pay more.
Mike McKee, thank you so much. And you're back for round two tomorrow. I'm sure we'll get many of the same questions. That was Bloomberg's Michael McKee, of course, tracking all things on the Fed. Another a load of questions Jay Powell got today had to do with Ukraine as well. And Ukraine is fighting at the moment to keep control of the eastern city of Bakhmut as Russian troops level the area. And President Zelensky is vowing to send reinforcements to bolster the city's defenses. For more on this, we want to bring in Jane Harman, chair of the Freedom House Board of Trustees. Jane, thank you so much for joining Joe and I this afternoon. We just got off from this Jay Powell testimony. Obviously, there's been this economic concerns about what's going on. But on the ground, Bakhmut is so central to Ukraine being able to fortify their forces. And Russia is, at the moment, making these inroads. What can you tell us in terms of how you are analyzing the situation?
Well, my sense is that, as usual, Ukraine is being very brave. The most important thing that Zelensky has done lately is to appoint a new head of his anti-corruption commission and to make clear to the West that he is eliminating corruption in his country. That is the precursor to integrating more with the West if this endless war is over. But in this case, Bakhmut is surrounded on three sides. Reportedly, the calculation Zelensky's making is that he'll wear down Russian forces, which are not very capable. The head of the Wagner Group is complaining about the quality of the forces, many of which are his, former convicts and the usual suspects being just thrown into this. So I think that Ukraine will hold on a bit, and let's see. I mean, if Russia's distracted here, maybe there'll be some offense that Ukraine can do elsewhere to reclaim territory.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, specifically these reports from the front line that the Wagner Group is running out of conscripts. They've been sending prisoners recently out of jail to their death, frankly, on a fairly daily basis here. Now we understand that they're actually running out of manpower. Is it possible for Ukraine to seize on this moment, Jane, and end this battle of attrition and actually move the front line?
Well, I don't know about end, but certainly degrade further this embarrassment for Putin, where he has untrained troops and convicts in his front line. As I understand it, the troops who are behind the convicts shoot them dead if they try to escape. So this doesn't sound like any kind of ready force. And Ukraine does have a highly trained force. They're asking for more weapons. They're asking for cluster bombs, which can cause a lot of damage. The sadness here is the human carnage is just enormous in this war. But I think they're doing the right things. And as I said, eliminating corruption as step one is a huge change in Ukraine over decades of endemic corruption.
Jane, based off your time in Congress, I want to bring you a little bit of a snippet from this report from the New York Times a few hours ago. They say that new intelligence reporting amounts to the first significant lead that the Nord Stream pipeline's attack was from a potential pro-Ukrainian group. If this was to be confirmed, how difficult will it be to get those individuals who are really on the line on whether or not they want to vote to send more aid to Ukraine?
Well, it will be more difficult. Let's understand that. It is also true, however, that Europe has done a good job of weaning itself from dependence on Russian oil and gas. The U.S. should be doing more to ship, I think, LNG to Europe, and the Middle East is sitting on its hands. But nonetheless, I think at this stage, this would be embarrassing news. It really would be. I'm not going to say it won't be, but I think that it won't turn the tide of support for Ukraine in Europe. I think Europe understands full well, certainly America does, and Joe Biden is doing a good job of leading the coalition, that if we can't stop Putin here, his next move is to move into Europe. So democracy is on trial. The West is on trial, and the West is doing a darn good job as a coalition of resisting and fighting.
I'm sure I don't need to tell you, Jane, about this new video that's been circulating. Ukraine has called it out, showing a Ukrainian soldier, as they claim in Kyiv, executed, unarmed, standing in the middle of the woods. It's a horrifying image, and they are launching a new war crimes investigation into this. What more can the U.S. do, though, to help Ukraine catalog these events and hold Russia accountable when the time comes?
We are helping, and international organizations are there. I was at a dinner with the chief prosecutor of Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and he says there are 66,000 documented cases of war crimes put together by very capable people. The question is where to try these. A few have been tried in Ukraine. The UN has to step up and do more. I think the tragedy is that the international organization, with the charter that is devoted to protecting the sovereignty of its members, is not able to stop one of its members, a member of the Security Council, from clearly and illegally invading the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Jane, I just want to ask you, since we have you here today, about Iran. Obviously, there's a recent reporting about they've now enriched uranium 84% purity. That's just short of the 90% that's needed. Some are saying this is a breakout period of 12 days, just under 2 weeks' time. How concerning is this for you, given the fact that there doesn't really seem to be a plan B from this administration?
Well, I think this is of great concern. What we need to be concerned about is Israel moving against Iran. Israel is determined to prevent Iran from getting the bomb. Breakout means that they have the capacity to build a bomb. It doesn't mean they are building a bomb. And let's understand that inflation in Ukraine is at, I think it's 500%. It's some astronomical figure. Their currency has collapsed. Their people are furious. The protests continue. And so I don't know exactly how much resilience they would have if they were possibly attacked. Question is then, if Israel attacks, what does the U.S. do? What is our plan B? you're right. What is our plan B? And the reports are that Russia may be goading Iran to act. I don't know if that's true, but that would put Israel in a difficult position, because let's remember that Israel has been neutral on providing any kind of military aid to Ukraine. They provide economic aid. And the reason is that Russia gives them permission to attack Iranian proxy groups in Syria. So we've got to elevate this to one of our top priorities. And perhaps this is happening and we're just not learning about it. That's okay with me, but we've got to have brain cells on this problem.
Jane, thanks for being with us as ever. Thanks to Jane Harman, chair of the Freedom House Board of Trustees, with us on Balance of Power. As we move to China now, with tensions between Beijing and Washington escalating on the heels of comments from China's foreign minister. Joining us to discuss, Ian Bremmer, the president, founder of Eurasia Group. Ian, it's great to have you with us. This is a relationship that is not getting any easier. And as we look at these comments here, if the U.S. does not hit the brakes, this is Beijing speaking, but continues to speak down the wrong path, no amount of guardrails can prevent derailing, and there will surely be a conflict and confrontation. Is the White House prepared for what might come next here, Ian? And how much of this bluster do you take seriously?
I take seriously the fact that the U.S. China relationship is in a pretty bad place right now. There's been very limited direct contact over the last 3 years. The pandemic and China's zero COVID response is responsible for most of that. But the reality is you just don't get a lot of real engagement from Chinese officials on Zoom calls. And when they've been talking in their own bubbles, they become more stereotyped, just as we all do when we don't engage directly with people who we don't necessarily trust. So they're coming out of the pandemic, I think, with a more hawkish perspective. The Americans, one of the few things that the Democrats and Republicans agree on is a tougher line policy on China. And even though Biden himself clearly has a long-standing relationship with Xi Jinping, and he wants to, and I've heard this directly from many, many times from the White House, they want to establish a floor under the U.S.-China relationship. They want more stability. Increasingly, Xi Jinping doesn't see it that way. That's a problem. And the bigger statement from Beijing was not from the new foreign minister. It was from Xi himself on Monday, where he directly called out and criticized the United States for a containment policy. And the Chinese president never does that directly. That's unusual. I take notice.
Yeah, I read that on Monday when he directly said the United States. Ian, is that rhetoric also supposed to be consumed not just for Washington, but also domestically? Are individuals in China getting frustrated with this war of words that they're hearing from Capitol Hill and the White House?
I'm not sure frustrated is the right term. I think they're getting increasingly nationalist/patriotic, as Americans are. They are. I mean, the Chinese media is much more willing today to call out what they see as hypocrisy as well as blemishes on U.S. domestic politics, fentanyl addiction, suicide rates, obesity, criminality, race problems. Historically, 10 years ago, you didn't see much of that domestically in China's press coverage. You see a lot of it now. They'd say, hey, domestic sovereignty. We don't talk about you guys internally. You don't talk about us internally. We don't like it when you do. Increasingly, the coverage that the average Chinese is getting of the United States is very non-nuanced. It's very negative. And that's a real problem because, I mean, ultimately, that means that there's going to be less political interest or demand from the Chinese government. They don't have elections, but they do have constituents. And if they're feeding their constituents an ongoing diet of the Americans are useless and ugly, then the relationship is going to get worse.
Let's zero in a little bit more on what President Xi said, because I'd like to pick up with you on that for a bit here, Ian. Quote,
sure.
That the U.S. is leading a group of nations to, quote, contain, encircle, and suppress China. He called it a challenge of unprecedented severity. To what extent can we compartmentalize this stuff and continue trading with China, or are we beginning to unwind this relationship economically for real?
Look, it's getting harder given statements like that and given policies that we see from the United States and China that are moving away from an extraordinary level of economic interdependence that still defines the relationship. I want to remind you, I'm talking to Bloomberg here, U.S. China trade levels as of 2022 are at record highs. right? So it's not like there is suddenly we're going to cut this relationship off. But why is she saying that? Some of it is the expanded military aid as well as boots on the ground advisors of American military in Taiwan. Some of that's that, and seeing a change of the status quo, however incremental. But a big piece of it are export controls. I mean, if you look at semiconductors, you look at 5G and Huawei, you look at what is coming down the pike on generative AI, on quantum computing. This is not about the United States trying to outcompete with the Chinese. This is about the Americans trying to contain the Chinese. In other words, trying to make sure that the Chinese do not have access to the top level technology. It doesn't matter if they can pay for it. Doesn't matter if they can subsidize it. America wants to ensure that America's lead in some of those areas is maintained. That means containing and suppressing the Chinese. And the United States getting American allies like Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, and others to align with the United States and therefore also contain and suppress the Chinese. Now, the Americans are not doing that in every space. You're not doing that with Coca-Cola. You're not doing that with LVMH. But you are doing it in the commanding heights of the technology economy, which happens to be one of the most critical areas out there. So, I mean, the Chinese they're not just making this stuff up. I mean, this is a strategic policy of the United States government.
Ian, thank you so much for joining us today. Ian Bremmer, president and founder of Eurasia Group. Ian brings up a great point. The record levels we're seeing in trade.
Right.
There's the business community pillar, and then there's the political pillar. And then just today, it seems the White House will be backing Senator Warner's bill.
The TikTok bill.
Yeah, which will allow them to prohibit TikTok.
So we have two alternate realities that are coexisting here, right? And your question was important. The sentiment in China, couple that with reports now about a possible Wuhan lab leak. This is going to get to be a much more difficult conversation with every leg, with every headline that we find here, and maintaining those record levels will come with that.
And especially ahead of 2024, because when that came out, already the former president lambasted.
And everyone's got to be a tough guy now.
Exactly. All right, coming up in the program, we're going to be talking about the budget and the state of the U.S. economy with Bharat Ramaroti, Deputy Director of the White House National Economic Council. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Inflation is extremely high, and it's hurting the working people of this country badly. All of them, not just 2 million of them, but all of them are suffering under high inflation, and we are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
And putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost, and they just have to bear it.
Will working people be better off if we just walk away from our jobs and inflation remains 5-6%?
Jay Powell there with Elizabeth Warren, a little bit of a spicy moment. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, alongside me, Joe Matthew. President Biden's budget proposal, also a key point this week, and that's set to be unveiled. And joining us now to preview that budget is Bharat Ramaroti, National Economic Council Deputy Director and Advisor for Strategic Economic Communications. Bharat, before we get to the budget on Thursday, we have to quickly I want to get your sense from the White House. Powell's talking about higher, potentially a little bit more aggressive, quicker in terms of higher interest rates. You saw that exchange there with Senator Warren, who's quite concerned about what this means for the labor market. Is the White House concerned?
Well, look, the Fed has its dual mandate. It has to pursue full employment while at the same time aiming for price stability. We believe very strongly in the Fed's independence, and we're going to let them be data-driven and take whatever steps they feel are necessary to take in order to achieve that dual mandate. What we in the White House are committed to doing, and what the president has identified as his top economic priority for over a year now, is helping the Fed in its effort to bring inflation down and get costs down for families. And we've taken a number of important steps, whether it's the historic release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve on gas prices, capping prescription drug costs, or even just earlier this week, we saw a great announcement from Eli Lilly that it's voluntarily capping the price of insulin at $35 a month for millions of people who rely on it. So we are using every tool that we have to help the Fed's effort to bring inflation down, because we agree it's going to have to come down from where it is today.
Bharat, as an economist, and I'm sure you think about this, I know you want to maintain independence from the Fed, but if we step back from this conversation, is the dual mandate a problem here when you've got a Fed chair trying to fight inflation and having to answer questions like that about damaging the job market? How do these coexist when, in fact, the job market will likely have to be damaged to win this battle?
Well, look, I think there's an open question about the extent to which the labor market will have to be negatively affected as the Fed continues to take steps to combat inflation. Look, there's a lot of discussion about whether part of that can be achieved just by bringing down the number of vacancies and bringing the labor market more into a balance with each other without a significant increase in the unemployment rate. Part of what we are trying to do is make the Fed's job as easy as possible, and we can do that by bringing costs down for American families and by bringing down the deficit. Remember, last year we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the few bills that have passed in the last few decades that actually brought down the deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 10 years and by more than $1 trillion over the next decade plus. So we're doing our part, and I do believe that the dual mandate is very important. I don't think that it's something that we should reconsider. The Fed's got to find that balance between pursuing maximum employment and price stability.
Bharat, another big issue that's brought up with Fed Chair Jay Powell is the fact that the White House needs to fill his number 2 seat with Lael Brainerd now at the NEC. There's been a lot of calls that this should be a diverse pick in terms of someone from the Latino community. Does the White House agree?
Well, look, we are looking at a wide range of nominees, a wide range of diverse nominees for this very important position. This administration has been taking historic steps in having a diverse team and a diverse economic team overall. So what we're aiming to do is find somebody who truly believes in the Fed's dual mandate, somebody who believes in the president's economic vision. I'm not going to get out ahead of the president's announcement on this front, but we take very seriously the calls for more diversity across the economic policy-making apparatus, including at the Fed.
You've got a big moment on Thursday at the White House. Bharat, the president is dropping his budget, of course, and both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue are gearing up for this. Interesting op-ed this morning in the New York Times from the president talking about raising taxes to pay for Medicare. How do you get tax hikes through this Congress now and a new Republican majority in the House when they're calling for cuts to spending?
Well, I'm glad you highlighted the president's op-ed because it lays out a very clear vision for where we should go on this important program. Remember, this is a program that each one of us, in every paycheck that we've gotten, pays a little bit into this program, and he's committed to making sure that those benefits are going to be available to all of us when we get to retirement age. The GOP has talked about in the past cutting Medicare benefits for people who've been paying into this program throughout their working lives. That is not our position. Our position is that we can strengthen Medicare, make sure that it lasts for another generation by asking the wealthy to pay just a little bit more, less than a 2% increase in taxes for people making over $400,000 a year, and building on the progress that we've already made in the last 2 years on bringing down prescription drug costs. That will further extend the life of Medicare. Look, I'm not going to talk about the political viability of this. My view is that the president's going to make his case, including to House Republicans, that this is the right way if they're serious about extending Medicare and dealing with the solvency issues that it has. This is the right way to go about it. If they have a different set of ideas, we welcome them, but I want to be clear. Any idea that is reliant on cutting Medicare benefits is going to be a non-starter with this president.
Bharat, though, to Joe's point, the Democrats had control of the House, the Senate, and the White House the last session, and they couldn't even close the carried interest loophole that benefited Wall Street. Do you really think this has any legs in Congress?
Well, look, we got an incredible amount done in the last 2 years, including tax increases on big corporations that have gotten away with paying $0 in federal corporate income taxes on tens of billions of dollars of profits every year. Look, we have a big agenda, a lot we want to get done, and we got a lot of it done in the last 2 years. We're going to fight very hard to get as much of it done over the next 2 years. The point is, the president is being clear about what his vision is. The budget is going to lay out his plan for how we can continue to invest in America, protect Social Security, lengthen the solvency of Medicare by another 25 years, continue to bring down costs for families, and, by the way, do all of that while reducing the deficit by more than $2 trillion over the next 10 years. Where's the GOP plan on any of this? What's their plan?
Considering the call for cuts from Capitol Hill, though, Bharat, just quickly in our last moment, where does President Biden want to cut spending in this plan?
Oh, he's going to detail on Thursday a number of areas where we can cut wasteful spending. We're going to be quite clear that there is places in the budget where we are spending tens, hundreds of billions of dollars unnecessarily. So stay tuned on Thursday where the president will lay that out in detail. But the point is we have to do this in a balanced way. Yes, we can cut wasteful spending, but there's also ways that we can raise taxes from high earners without affecting economic growth and putting us on a much better fiscal path.
Thanks for spending some time with us. Bharat Ramamurthy, National Economic Council Deputy Director and Advisor for Strategic Economic Communications on a sunny day on the North Lawn of the White House. Coming up, stocks sliding on the heels of Jay Powell's testimony today on Capitol Hill. We'll have more ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Good afternoon. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. Stocks this afternoon sinking and bond yields on the rise as investors grapple with Fed Chair Jay Powell's comments before the Senate Banking Committee. For more on all the action, let's bring in Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Hi, Abigail.
Hey, Anne-Marie. Well, you know, it's interesting here because we do, of course, have stocks lower. They started on shaky ground right around even, but right now that S&P 500 down about 0.9%. The Dow down a little bit more, down 1% on light volume as we have seen. But it's interesting because it certainly is a reaction to Fed Chair Jay Powell's testimony to Senate. And I would argue he hasn't said anything all that new. This is classic Fed steering. The last time Powell spoke, he was relatively benign. Now a bit of a tougher talk on what he has been saying, and the Fed has been saying for months now, higher and longer if needed, even willing to sacrifice the economy. The difference here, markets taking him a bit more seriously. And from the swaps perspective, the WIRP function, the world interest rate probability in the Bloomberg terminal is now showing 562 in September, and basically a number of hikes ahead, including the possibility of 50 basis points in this March meeting. But it's data dependent. So this jobs report coming up on Friday is going to be critical.
Well, exactly. That's why Mike McKee says this is a 72-hour life that this testimony has, because at 8:30 on Friday, it can all be dissolved. Abigail, looking at one stock specifically today, because this is an important story in Washington, is Walgreens. They're down some 2%, and they're really in the crosshairs of a political story.
They are, because Gavin Newsom, governor of California, is saying that California may no longer do business with them if they do stop selling their abortion pill in 20 Republican states under the pressure of some of those attorney generals. He's basically saying that he's directed the California Department of Health and Human Services to review its relationships with Walgreens has with the state, including Medi-Cal and Covered California, the state's two largest insurance plans. There's a lot of ambiguity here, but it is very important because California is obviously a big market. This could, in fact, hit Walgreens' bottom line if something official does happen. Walgreens is saying that they're trying to sell this drug everywhere that they legally can, but in these certain states, attorney generals have put them under pressure. The stock down 2%. So it's interesting to see these political headlines hitting the stock.
Right, because last week, Walgreens was also in the press because they said they cannot legally sell in these 20 states because the attorney generals say they're going to be sued. And now the California governor is saying, well, because of that, now we're going to cut ties with you. This is going to be something that on top of this week, last week it was about ESG. It seems like it's becoming incredibly difficult for corporate America to navigate the politics in the Capitol. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for that wrap and a deep dive also on what's going on with Walgreens. Before we wrap up, just a note, check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and, of course, online. Coming up next, Bloomberg Crypto, right here on Bloomberg Television. This is Balance of Power. We'll see you same time tomorrow.